Zora Neale Hurston was a pioneering Black woman. She was both a scholar and artist at a time when Black women were expected to be neither.
As a cultural preservationist, she wants to make certain that the people coming afterwards, generation after generation, know their antecedents and the rich culture of their antecedents.
I like to think of Hurston as one who is sister to the blues women of the 1920s, heir to the same legacy that Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey inherited, and she was a traveling woman.
Zora Neale Hurston was the most significant, most prolific, and most published Black woman writer of the first half of the 20th century.
However one wishes to define her, folklorist, trailblazing anthropologist, or provocative novelist and essayist, Zora Neale Hurston was a literary pioneer who, through uncompromised determination, has emerged today as one of the most significant collectors and interpreters of Southern African American folklore. From Public Radio International, I'm Vanessa Williams. And for the next hour, we explore the extraordinary life and times of Zora Neale Hurston. It was during one of the major events in American history that Hurston made her gutsy and flamboyant Harlem debut. The post-Reconstruction era set off a wave of Western and Northern migration that stretched over 4 decades. Hundreds of thousands of Southern blacks, having long suffered under discriminatory, repressive, and sometimes deadly devices, including black codes, Jim Crow laws, sharecropping, and lynchings, made their way to the West, Midwest, and Northern cities in search of better-paying jobs and greater economic opportunities. Harlem, in particular, became a magnet for many migrating blacks, as large sections of the city that had been segregated prior to 1920 were now available to families, artists, singers, writers, and intellectuals. This exodus, urged on by the hopes of political and economic advancement, coincided with a burgeoning literary, cultural, and artistic uprising. Its early crafters, an alliance spearheaded by Alan Locke, called it the New Negro Movement. Hurston biographer Robert Hemingway describes how these concurring events transformed Harlem into what he called a mecca for black artistic hopes.
People were moving into Harlem because it was an area that had previously been segregated against black people owning houses and apartments there. And in the decade of 1910 to 1920, the Harlem Renaissance is usually referred to as the period of the 1920s. Some people would extend it beyond that or started a little bit earlier, but it's basically the period of the 20s when an awful lot of African-American writers and artists and singers and intellectuals came to New York. Politically, the New Negro movement was built around the idea that black people were not going to any longer abide by discriminatory treatment and the second-hand citizenship that they'd been offered by American society. And so the New Negro was somebody who was not going to quietly stand by like the old Negro had and let black people be discriminated against. That was the political context for it. The New Negro movement and the Harlem Renaissance really are kind of synonymous terms. The cultural and aesthetic context for it was that you had people like Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes and Arnabone Thompson and Wallace Thurman and various other writers and artists of the period who came to New York, lived in Harlem, knew each other, went to each other's parties, got involved with the Civil Rights Organization, the Urban League, and the NAACP. All of that sort of came together in the Harlem Renaissance, and it's a very convenient label for a period of sort of intense artistic activity, which Zora Neale Hurston was right at the center of.
Hurston arrived in Harlem in January of 1925, after what she would later call her time of wandering, years spent moving between family members, traveling with a theater group, and attempting in spurts to further her education. 2 years prior to coming to New York, she had been an English student at Howard University. It was there that she'd met Professor Alan Locke, who was more than eager to discover and promote emerging Black artistic talent. Hurston had written a number of short stories and was encouraged to enter some of the many literary contests designed to seek out the type of artistic talent Renaissance agents would use to fuel their movement. Charles Johnson was editor of Opportunity, a magazine published by the National Urban League. He was so impressed with Hurston's submissions that he wrote to her while she was still at Howard University, suggesting she consider moving to New York, where the Harlem Renaissance was in full bloom. Hurston had struggled with little or no money for almost 10 years, just waiting for the opportunity to make her imprint on the world. Hurston biographer Valerie Boyd suggests that this small amount of encouragement was all Hurston needed. Her literary talent and bodacious personality would do the rest.
She packed up her few belongings, left Howard University, and just with $1.50 in her purse, moved to New York City. And very quickly elbowed her way into the Harlem Renaissance, meeting people like Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen and some of the other writers of that era. That was an Opportunity Awards dinner in May of 1925, and that was sort of Zora's coming out party in New York. So at this party, this after party after the Opportunity Awards dinner, where Zora won more awards than anyone. She won 4 awards, and people who didn't know about her suddenly were hearing about this writer, Zora Neale Hurston, who kept getting up to get her awards. So she certainly raised a few eyebrows there, so people became aware of her. And she entered this after party with a colorful scarf wrapped around her neck, and she flung the scarf around her neck in a very showy way, a very flamboyant way, and entered the party saying, "Color struck," announcing the name of her award-winning play. And that was her entrance into that kind of Harlem literary community. In fact, Langston Hughes wrote to Carl Van Vechten, the novelist and photographer, a few weeks later. He had been at that party, and he wrote to Carl Van Vechten saying, "Zora Neale Hurston is a colorful girl. I think I'd like to know her better." That was sort of how people responded to that very bold act of self-introduction at that after party.
Hurston had made her way north from the anonymity of Eatonville, Florida, the oldest Black incorporated municipality in America, and into the consciousness of some of the most prominent benefactors and major players of the Harlem Renaissance. At this awards dinner, she would meet Annie Nathan Mayer, who would prove instrumental in getting Hurston accepted into the elite, all-white Barnard College. She would meet and befriend Fannie Hurst, a popular figure and well-received writer who would contribute to Hurston's success at Barnard. Hurston seemed to knowingly take full advantage of every relationship and opportunity afforded to her that night, which proved to be a pivotal moment in her life after a long and difficult journey, one that began with the sudden death of her mother when Hurston was 13 years old. Valerie Boyd.
Zora's mother was really the glue that held the family together. And Zora was especially close to her mother. Her mother always encouraged Zora and her other kids to jump at the sun. She said, "You might not reach the stars, but at least you'll get off the ground." So her mother was a real encourager for her, and also stood between Zora and her father, who didn't get along so much with Zora. He was sort of disappointed at Zora being his second daughter. He had 6 sons and 2 daughters. He was delighted to have the first daughter, but the second daughter he felt was just, as he put it, another girl child to wear out shoes and bring in nothing. There was tension between Zora and her father from the beginning. After her mother died, that tension escalated, and Zora was really sort of thrust into adulthood. Her father sent her away to school, and then he didn't pay the tuition for the school, and basically from about the time of about 14 or 15, Zora was really forced to sort of make her own way into adulthood. That moment really shifted her life. She struggled financially and was really poor and did whatever she could just to survive for several years. That was really the abrupt ending of her childhood when she left Eatonville.
For nearly a decade, Hurston was shuffled between family members, worked as a domestic, and held other menial jobs. While the details of her life during this period are still largely unaccounted for, it is clear she never gave up her quest for an education.
After her mother's death, or after she was sort of disappeared from the public record.
Valerie Boyd.
From about the age of 15 or 16 all the way up to age 26, there are very few records of Zora during that 10-year period. She sort of went under the radar, and you have to understand that it was fairly easy for a black woman to go under the radar during that time if she wasn't attached to a man in some way as wife or daughter. She didn't reemerge on the public record until she was 26 years old and living in Baltimore. It was 1917. Her older sister lived in Baltimore. At that point, Zora was 26 years old but still hadn't finished high school. So in order to qualify for free public schooling in the state of Maryland, she lopped 10 years off of her life and told school officials she was 16 rather than 26. And in that way, she was able to reinvent herself. But it was that act of reinvention, just to really lop those years off of her life, that really propelled her into the person that she would ultimately become. And of course, once she lopped those 10 years off, she never added them back on.
Hurston had the remarkable ability to refashion herself throughout her life, often taking the road less traveled. She was both a scholar and an artist at a time when black women were expected to be neither. It was Cheryl Wall, professor of English at Rutgers, who discovered Hurston's actual birthplace and date while researching the 1900 census. She uncovered many revealing details of Hurston's life, facts that would shed light on her incredible artistic endeavors.
Hurston was a myth maker, and I think she treated her life as another story that she was free to embellish and revise as she chose. She always claimed to be born in Eatonville, and certainly that's where she grew up, but that wasn't where she was born. She's recorded in the 1900 census as being 9 years old and as having been born in Notasulga, Alabama, rather than in Eatonville. The census records are also fascinating because Eatonville is such a small town. The whole record for Eatonville is 2 or 3 pages in the census, and you find out, too, that so many of the names that Hurston gives her characters in her stories and novels are in fact the names of her neighbors. And that I think it's important because one of the ways that Hurston is able to avoid the stereotypes largely derived from minstrelsy that had so much characterized African American characterization in fiction, she wrote herself out of that by basing her stories on the lives and experiences of her neighbors. So the census records are rich for several reasons.
Before Zora Neale Hurston graduated from Barnard in 1928 with a bachelor's degree in English, she studied alongside famed anthropologist Franz Boas. And through the support of personal financiers such as Charlotte Osgood Mason and several Guggenheim fellowships, she traveled back to her beloved rural South, collecting and documenting black folklore, stories, and folk music, hanging out at juke joints, turpentine camps, and saw and lumber mills, traveling with a car she called Sassy Sue, and a shiny new pearl-handled pistol,